The letter of dismissal was still on the table when the carriage came to take her away. Mariette Colford did not look at it again. She had read it once, standing in the doorway of what had been her father's study, and once had been enough. Her uncle's handwriting was small and precise, the way a man's handwriting looks when he has practiced being careful his whole life. The position of housekeeper's assistant has been arranged at Dunmore Hall. You will depart Thursday morning. Further correspondence on the matter of the estate will be directed to my solicitor. Not to her, to his solicitor. She was 23 years old, the only child of Sir Edmund Colford, and she was being sent to work in a house that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. She did not say this. There was no one left to say it to. The coachman did not speak to her on the journey north, which suited her well enough. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the countryside change from the soft, cultivated hills near her uncle's property to something wilder and older, long stretches of moorland interrupted by stone walls, sheep standing in the rain as though they had always been there and always would be. She had not been to Dunmore Hall since she was 11 years old. She remembered it as a place of long corridors and heavy curtains and a smell she could not name, something like cedar and old paper and something mineral underneath, like stone after rain. Her father had loved it. He had taken her there once to meet the current Lord Dunmore's mother, a sharp-eyed woman named Lady Aldra, who had served tea in a room full of blue and white porcelain, and spoken to her father as though they were the last 2 people in the world who understood something important. Mariette had sat on a small chair near the window and watched them and thought that grown-up friendships looked like a private language she did not yet speak. Lady Aldra had died 2 years before her father. Her father had died in the autumn, of a fever that moved too quickly for anyone to do anything useful. And then the lawyers had come, and her uncle, and the letters, and the small and precise handwriting that had been redirecting her life ever since. She had not fought it. She had told herself this was wisdom, not weakness. She had told herself that until she half believed it. The hall appeared through the trees at dusk, when the light was doing that uncertain thing it does in autumn, not quite gone, but not reliable either. It was larger than she remembered. The stone was dark from the rain, and the east wing was covered in scaffolding, which surprised her. She had not known there was any work being done. A man in a heavy coat was standing near the gate, speaking to someone she could not see, and he did not look up as the carriage passed. The housekeeper met her at the servants' entrance. Her name was Mrs. Felworth, a wide, competent woman in her 50s, who had the manner of someone who had outlasted a great deal of inconvenience and expected to outlast more. "Miss Colford," she said, and nothing in her face suggested she had ever heard the name before, which was a relief and also, quietly, something else. "You'll be sharing a room with one of the kitchen maids until the North Hall is sorted. His Grace doesn't entertain at present, so it's mostly maintenance work and correspondence. You'll assist me in managing the household records and receiving deliveries. Can you write a fair hand?" "Yes," Mariette said. Mrs. Felworth nodded as though she had expected no less. "Good, we eat at 6. There's a rule about the East Wing. No one goes in without the housekeeper or His Grace present. The scaffolding's been up since spring, and some of the floor is not reliable. You understand?" "I understand." "Good." The housekeeper turned. Then she stopped and looked back, and for a moment something moved across her face that Mariette could not quite read. "Your father," she said carefully. "He was Sir Edmund of Colford in Wiltshire." Mariette went still. "Yes." Mrs. Felworth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew your mother, briefly, a long time ago." She said it the way people say things that cost them something to say, quickly, as though the speed of it makes it hurt less. She was a very kind woman. She did not wait for a response. She walked ahead, and Mariette followed, and neither of them said anything else. The first week was only work. Mariette was good at work, which was the one useful thing her new circumstances had given her. She organized the household records, which had not been properly maintained since the previous housekeeper left in July. She cataloged the deliveries and wrote the correspondence that Mrs. Felworth dictated, and she learned the rhythms of the house the way you learn anything you have to live inside of, slowly and then all at once. She learned that Lord Dunmore, Hugh Dunmore, the fifth of that title, 32 years old, was in residence but rarely visible. He worked in the library for most of the morning and rode in the afternoon when the weather permitted. He had no guests and seemed to prefer it that way. The staff spoke of him with the particular kind of careful respect that means something more complicated than admiration. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that he noticed things, and that the things he noticed stayed with him. He doesn't miss much, the kitchen maid told her, a girl named Penny who was 17, and had a tendency to say things plainly that more experienced people would have said sideways. Last month he knew one of the footmen had been sneaking letters out for the contractor's son before anyone else did. Just noticed it. Didn't say anything for a week and then said it quietly, and that was that. And the footman? Still here. His grace isn't unfair. Penny shrugged. Just thorough, Mariette. Thought about that. She thought about it more than she probably should have. She did not encounter Lord Dunmore directly for 11 days. This was partly the natural geography of a large house, and partly she suspected, by design, not his but hers. She had arranged her movements without quite admitting that she was arranging them, keeping to the household office and the upper corridors, avoiding the library and the study and the main staircase in the late mornings when she knew he might be crossing it. She was not ready for him to look at her and see nothing. That was the thing she had not let herself examine too closely. Her father had been a friend of this family, of Lady Aldra, at least, and presumably of the late Lord Dunmore before her. There were years of correspondence somewhere, letters going back and forth between Wiltshire and this house that she had never read but had always known existed, part of the texture of her father's life, the way certain books and certain friendships are, always present, never requiring explanation. She did not know if any of that meant anything to the current lord. She did not know if it was possible for a debt of friendship to pass between generations, or if it simply ended when the people who had made it were gone. She thought about asking Mrs. Felworth. She did not ask. On the 12th day, she was carrying a stack of account books from the office to the archive room at the end of the south corridor when she heard someone on the main staircase. She turned the corner and walked directly into Lord Dunmore. The books did not fall. She caught them, barely, with both hands pressed hard against the covers, and stood there in the corridor with her heart doing something she chose not to name. He stepped back to give her room. He was taller than she had expected, and less formally dressed. No jacket, his sleeves turned back, the kind of casual undress that said he had not expected to encounter anyone either. He looked at her with attention that was not rude but was complete, the way someone looks when they are genuinely trying to understand something they have not yet classified. "Mrs. Felworth's assistant," he said. Not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. I apologize for the— You didn't drop anything." He said it with something that was almost amusement, but was too dry to be called that. "That's the relevant fact. What are you doing with the Michaelmas records from 3 years ago?" She was surprised. "You know which records these are? I know which records go where in this house." He said it without any particular pride as plain information. "Those belong in the secondary archive, not the main one. The sorting system here is not obvious. Mrs. Felworth can explain it if she hasn't already." "She did explain it," Mariette said. "I must have misunderstood." He looked at her again, not in the way that she had been afraid of, not the blank look of a man who sees nothing worth seeing. something else. She had the strange sensation of being measured by a man who had not yet decided what to measure against. "Colford," he said, and her name in his mouth was startling. She had given only her surname to Mrs. Felworth, as was correct, as was expected. She had not thought, "That's an unusual name for this part of the country. My family is from Wiltshire, Your Grace." A pause. Something moved across his face that she could not read. Then he said, "Bring those to the secondary archive," and walked past her down the corridor, and she stood in the quiet for a long moment before she moved. Mrs. Felworth came to find her that evening. Mariette was in the small sitting room the staff used after dinner, attempting to read something that was not the household accounts, which she had been reading for most of the day. Mrs. Felworth sat down across from her with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to say a thing they have been considering for some time. "His Grace asked me about you," she said. Mariette put her book down. "What did you tell him?" "Your name, that you came with references from your uncle, that you were recently arrived." Mrs. Felworth folded her hands in her lap. "He asked if you were any relation to Edmund Colford of Wiltshire." There was a long silence. "What did you say?" Mariette asked, and her voice was even, which she was proud of. "I said I didn't know," Mrs. Felworth said, "because I had not asked you directly." She looked at Mariette steadily. "Are you? He was my father." The housekeeper was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was doing something complicated with the eaves of the house, a low, uneven sound. "Your uncle sent you here," she said finally. "Not a question. He arranged the position, yes, and you came." Another long pause. "Knowing the house," Mariette confirmed. Mrs. Felworth looked at her, not unkindly, with something that might have been respect or the early shape of it. "You should know," she said carefully, "that your father wrote to Lady Aldra, His Grace's mother, 3 months before he died. I know this because I carried the letters. I did not read them, but I know they existed, and I know she kept them because I helped her file them in the library correspondence box, in the section she reserved for what she called important things." Mariette's hands were very still in her lap. "And is that box still?" "I don't know what His Grace has done with his mother's correspondence." Mrs. Felworth stood. "I am telling you only what I know." She moved toward the door, and then she stopped, and Mariette thought she was going to say something else, something significant, but instead she only said, "Breakfast is at 7 tomorrow. He has a surveyor coming for the East Wing at 9, so I'll need you in the office early." She left. Mariette sat in the quiet for a while and thought about letters in a box in the library, in a section reserved for important things. She might never have gone into the library. She had told herself this was appropriate, that the library was not her domain, that nothing in her position gave her any right to that room, or those shelves, or anything that might or might not be filed in a box near the window. She told herself this with considerable firmness for 4 more days. On the 5th day, she found herself standing in the doorway. It was early, barely past 6, and the house was quiet in the way that means everyone else is still deciding whether to be awake. The library door had been left ajar. She could see the light coming in through the east-facing windows, falling on the long table, the shelves, the reading chairs with their green leather gone soft from use. She went in. The correspondence boxes were where Mrs. Felworth had indicated they would be, on a shelf to the left of the window, labeled in Lady Aldra's handwriting, in a hand that was larger and less careful than her son's. Family, estate, solicitor, staff, and at the end, in slightly darker ink, as though she had labeled it later, important. Mariette stood in front of that last box for a long time. She reached for it. Her fingers were on the edge of the lid. "That one," said a voice behind her, "is locked." She turned. Lord Dunmore was standing in the doorway, dressed for the morning, his coat on, which meant he had come downstairs intending to go somewhere and had found her here instead. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not anger, not quite. Something more considered than anger. "I'm sorry," she said. "The door was open. I should not have. What were you looking for?" The question was direct in the way she was starting to understand was simply how he spoke. No social softening, no room for her to pretend the question had not been asked. She could have lied. She was aware of this. She had been managing small, careful untruths for 2 months, not large ones, only the one that mattered most, only her name and what her name meant, only the fact that the house she was cataloging had in some previous version belonged to her, and to her father and to his mother before him. She had been practicing the shape of a smaller self, a woman with no claim on anything, who had come to this place because her uncle had sent her and not for any other reason. She said, "My father's letters." The silence that followed was very long. Lord Dunmore walked into the room. He did not go to the correspondence shelf. He went to the chair behind the reading table and sat down, and he looked at her with that same complete attention, and he said, "Colford, Edmund Colford's daughter." "Yes." "He told his name wrong on the letters," he said, and she blinked, and he continued, "He signed them E. Colford, which could be anyone. I didn't know who E. Colford was until my mother's solicitor went through her estate. By then I had already read them. Her throat was very tight. What did they say?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at her for a while, and she had the sense that he was deciding something he had perhaps been deciding since the moment in the corridor when she'd told him her name. "Your father wrote to my mother because he was concerned about what would happen to you," he said. "He was ill. He knew he was ill. He wanted. He did not want to make demands of a friendship that had been conducted largely by correspondence, but he wanted someone to know your name. He wanted someone in a position to—" He stopped. "He wanted someone to notice if you needed noticing." The room was very quiet. Outside, the first light was going gold on the moorland. "Did you know that?" he asked. "That he wrote to her?" "No," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I did not know." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "My mother died before she could act on it. I found the letters 14 months ago. I had my solicitor make inquiries about your circumstances." He paused. "The inquiries indicated you were living with your uncle and that the situation was—" Another pause. "Adequate." "It was adequate," she said carefully. "And then you appeared in my house as a housekeeper's assistant. My uncle arranged the position." "Yes." Something moved through his eyes that she could not name. "I expect he did." They looked at each other across the table. Mariette became aware, in some part of her mind that was still operating practically, that the surveyor was coming at 9 and that she was supposed to be in the office. She did not move. "The locked box," she said. "You have the letters." "I have my mother's half of the correspondence," he said. "Your father's letters came to me with the estate. My mother's replies presumably went to Wiltshire, and I suspect your uncle has them now, or has disposed of them." He said this without emotion, but his jaw was doing something very slight and controlled. "In the last letter she wrote to your father, she wrote after his was received, before she knew he had already died. She said she would see to things. She used those words. I will see to things, Edmund. You have my word on it. She died 11 days later." Mariette said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I am telling you," he said, "because I believe you have a right to know what your father intended, and because I want you to understand something." He stood. He walked to the correspondence shelf, and he took a small key from his breast pocket, and he unlocked the box labeled important, and he took out a single folded letter and held it out to her. "This is the last one he sent. She would have wanted you to have it." She took it. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised by this. She did not read it immediately. She held it and looked at the handwriting on the outside. which she recognized as her father's, and felt the old familiar shape of him. The way he had always been more comfortable in writing than in speaking, the way he had loved her with great consistency and very few words, and she thought, he sent someone ahead of himself. He could not be there, so he sent his words instead, and trusted someone else to pass them on. "Thank you," she said. Lord Dunmore was looking at her. The morning light had moved, as morning light does, and the room had changed entirely from the uncertain thing it had been at 6 o'clock. "You came here knowing it was your family's house," he said. "It was not a question." "My father's family on his mother's side." "Yes, and the position your uncle arranged." "I don't know if he knew," she said. "I don't know if he arranged it to be cruel or if it was simply the position available. My uncle is not a man who thinks carefully about the difference." She paused. "I wanted to see it. I didn't have another way." Something crossed his face that she thought, for a moment, might be the early edge of anger, but it was not aimed at her. It passed, and what replaced it was quieter and more settled. "Mrs. Felworth tells me you've been managing the McColmus records," he said. The shift was so abrupt she almost laughed. "I have. There's a portrait in the East Corridor," he said, "covered in cloth since the restoration work began. It's a woman, early middle age, painted around 40 years ago. I have not been able to identify her. My mother's records have no notation for it." He looked at her steadily. "I wonder if you might recognize her." Mariette thought about this. She thought about what it meant to be asked. "I might," she said. The East Corridor was cold from the restoration work. The smell of plaster and wood resin mixing with the older smell of the house underneath. The scaffolding had changed the shape of the space, narrowed it, made it feel like something in the process of becoming rather than something finished. The portrait was near the end of the corridor, covered in a sheet that had gone gray with plaster dust. Lord Dunmore lifted it himself. He did not hand the task to anyone else. Mariette looked at the painting. She recognized her immediately. The jaw was the same, the way the light settled along the cheekbone, the particular way the subject held herself. Upright, but not rigidly. A woman who had decided that her posture was a private matter between herself and her own good opinion. "That is my grandmother," Mariette said. "My father's mother. Amelia Colford, before she married." She paused. Before she married, her name was Amelia Dunmore. The silence in the corridor was complete. Lord Dunmore said very carefully, "She was." "Your grandfather's sister," Mariette said. "I think. I do not know the precise connection. My father mentioned it once when I was young. He said the families had been tangled together longer than anyone could properly remember." She looked at the portrait, at her grandmother's composed and unconcealed face. "He said the house remembered her. He said houses do that." Hugh Dunmore was very still. She was aware of him with a sharpness she had been managing carefully for 2 weeks, the awareness of someone whose presence you have been quietly noting without permission. "Your father's letter," he said slowly. "He said he had one request of my mother. He said he did not ask for money or intervention, only that if something happened to him, and if Mariette, he used your name, he wrote it down. If Mariette found herself in difficult circumstances, that someone would see her. Those were his exact words." He stopped, looked at the portrait. "See her?" She said nothing. "I read that letter 14 months ago," he said, "and I have thought about those words more than I expected to." He turned to look at her. "I employed a housekeeper's assistant 3 weeks ago without knowing who she was, and she has been managing my McColmus records." There was something in his voice that she could not name. Not quite amusement, not quite anything she had a word for. "They were very disorganized," she said. "They were," he agreed. "They are considerably less so now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a proposition, not informal employment. A formal one." He looked at her directly. "My estate solicitor has been arguing with me for 18 months that I need someone to manage the household records properly. someone with the authority to make the decisions that Mrs. Felworth cannot be expected to make because they are not within her remit, someone who understands correspondence and property. He paused. Someone who knows the house. Mariette looked at him. You want to make me a steward? I want to give you a position that reflects what you actually are, he said, rather than what your uncle decided you should be. The corridor was quiet. The scaffolding creaked in some distant draft. Her grandmother's painted face was patient and untroubled by the fact that this was taking so long. I will need to write to my uncle, Mariette said. Your uncle, Lord Dunmore said, will receive a letter from my solicitor first, explaining the situation. A pause. I expect he will find it clarifying. She looked at him. She had come to this house holding herself to a careful smallness, the practiced shape of a woman with no claim on anything. She had told herself this was wise. She had told herself that being unseen was a form of safety, that asking for nothing was a form of protection. Her father had understood something she had not. He had sent his words ahead of himself, into a house that remembered his mother, to a woman who had kept them in a box, labeled with the word important, until she died and could not pass them on, so that her son had carried them instead for 14 months, until the woman they were written for had walked through his door. Yes, she said. All right. Lord Dunmore nodded once. He covered the portrait again, carefully, with the cloth. He would have it properly cleaned, he said, when the east wing was finished, when the house was ready. He walked back down the corridor, and she followed, and neither of them said anything more. But she noticed, she could not help noticing, that he moved through the house the way someone moves through a place they know belongs to them, entirely, without apology. And she thought, perhaps I will learn to walk that way again. The letter was still in her pocket, her father's handwriting still unread. She would read it tonight in the small sitting room after dinner, with the fire and the wind in the eaves. He had always been better at the written word than the spoken one. He had always loved her most in sentences. She pressed her hand once against her pocket, just briefly, just to feel the shape of it, and then she went to the office to begin the work that was hers to do.